hunting true Halloween horror stories, The Whispering Shadows of Pine Hollow. There's a place deep in the woods of rural Tennessee known to locals as Pine Hollow. Nestled at the bottom of a dense, winding forest, the town itself lies on the edge of those cursed woods. By day, it's a peaceful enough place. But by night, when the sun sets and the shadows stretch long, Pine Hollow transforms into something darker. And on Halloween night, for nearly a century, people have gone missing, swallowed whole by the darkness, never to return. Old-timers recall stories passed down through generations of friends and neighbors disappearing without a trace. In the 1920s, it was a boy named Samuel who first went missing. Only 7 years old, Samuel had been warned, like all children in Pine Hollow, never to play near the woods after dark, especially not on Halloween. But he had a wild spirit and was never one for listening. He left his home on the edge of town, just before twilight, holding a lantern high as he ventured into the hollow with his dog. The next morning, his parents found the dog barking madly at the hollow's edge, but Samuel was gone. The lantern was sitting in the grass, flickering in the morning breeze. His shoes were neatly placed beside it. No one ever found him. Since that night, the whispers began. Locals speak of eerie, disembodied voices that drift from the hollow on Halloween night, calling out to those foolish enough to venture too close. In the years that followed Samuel's disappearance, more souls went missing. Teenagers daring each other to step just 1 foot inside the hollow. Hunters who thought they could brave the night. Even a few adults wandering off from Halloween parties, drawn by a voice only they could hear. In 1999, a group of teenagers set out to prove it was all nonsense, urban legend mixed with old folklore. They camped on the edge of Pine Hollow, setting up a bonfire and cracking jokes, drinking beer, and daring each other to go deeper into the woods. By midnight, the atmosphere changed. The air grew unnaturally cold, and the flames flickered as a dense fog began to roll in. One by one, the teens heard it. Their names whispered from the tree line. A voice that sounded so familiar yet impossibly distant. 3 of them vanished that night. Their tents were still standing, but the sleeping bags inside were empty. Only one returned, her hair turned stark white from the experience. She wouldn't speak much about what happened, but the townsfolk say her screams echoed throughout the night. She spoke of shadows that whispered her name, and hands, cold, invisible hands, that reached out from the trees, dragging her friends into the hollow. She was found wandering the streets of Pine Hollow at dawn, drenched in sweat, mumbling about something watching them from the darkness. She was institutionalized shortly after. No one has dared to enter Pine Hollow since. But every Halloween, those same whispers drift out from the trees, calling, waiting for someone to answer. The Midnight Visitor of Crescent Street. In the fall of 1983, in the quiet, unassuming town of Willow Creek, the residents of Crescent Street began to notice something strange. It started subtly at first, like a chill in the air. The street had always been a peaceful neighborhood, white picket fences, children playing in the yards, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night. But one by one, the households on Crescent Street began to experience something unsettling. It started with the small things. A chair that had been moved from its usual spot. A window opened that no one remembered opening. Pictures on the walls slightly askew. At first, the families laughed it off, blaming it on a draft or a forgetful mind. But as the days wore on, the disturbances became more sinister. One October night, the Morgans, a young couple who lived at the end of the street, woke up to find all the furniture in their living room rearranged. Every chair, every table, every item was in a different place than it had been when they went to bed. A creeping sense of dread settled over them, but still they tried to rationalize it. Then, a week before Halloween, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman living alone, woke to find a new photograph in the frame above her fireplace. She had no memory of placing it there. The photograph showed a shadowy figure standing in the corner of her bedroom. It wasn't clear who or what it was, but the longer she stared at it, the more she felt like it was watching her. The police were called, but there was no sign of a break-in. No forced entry, no fingerprints, no explanation. The officers, skeptical of the elderly woman's story, left after making a report. But the events continued. Pets began disappearing, cats, dogs, even a few birds. Then came the strange marks. long scratches on the windowsills, as if something had tried to get in or out. The families grew more and more anxious, unable to sleep, waking up to new disturbances each morning. On Halloween night, 1983, everything came to a head. The Murphys, a family with 2 young children, were hosting a small Halloween gathering. Around midnight, after the guests had left and the children were tucked into bed, Mr. Murphy heard a faint knock on the front door. When he opened it, no one was there. But just as he was about to close the door, a figure appeared at the end of the driveway, a tall, lanky silhouette, dressed in black, with a wide-brimmed hat casting its face in shadow. Mr. Murphy called out, asking if the man needed help, but the figure remained silent, motionless. Suddenly, all the lights in the house flickered and went out. In the dark, Mr. Murphy heard the soft sound of footsteps on the porch, followed by a sharp knock on the door, once, twice, 3 times. The next morning, the Murphy family was gone. The house was locked from the inside, the windows sealed shut. The police were baffled. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing. Just an empty house, as if the family had vanished into thin air. Neighbors swore they saw the same tall figure standing in the street that night watching, but by morning it was gone and the Murphys were never seen again. Crescent Street was never the same. To this day, residents say they hear footsteps outside their windows at night and soft knocks on their doors, but no one dares to answer. The Screaming Bride of Blackmore Manor. In the late 1800s, Blackmore Manor was a grand estate known for its lavish parties and elegant gardens. The Montague family, wealthy aristocrats, had lived there for generations, their fortunes made in shipping and trade. But Blackmore Manor was also known for something else, a ghost story that still haunts the region to this day. In 1872, on a cold October evening, Elizabeth Montague, the youngest daughter of the family, was set to be married. The wedding was to be the event of the season, with hundreds of guests attending. Elizabeth was a strikingly beautiful woman, with dark hair and pale skin, and many suitors had sought her hand, but it was Charles Whitmore, a wealthy landowner, who had won her heart. The ceremony was grand, the reception even grander, with laughter and music echoing through the halls of the manor. But as the evening wore on, Elizabeth began to feel a sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just after midnight, as the guests danced in the ballroom, Elizabeth vanished. Her husband, Charles, searched the entire manor, calling her name, but she was nowhere to be found. Hours passed, and the guests began to grow anxious, fearing the worst. At dawn, they found her. Elizabeth was lying in the garden, her wedding gown soaked in blood, her throat slit from ear to ear. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. No one could explain what had happened or how she had ended up there. In the weeks that followed, Charles descended into madness, locking himself away in the manor and refusing to speak to anyone. Some say he could be heard talking to Elizabeth late at night, begging her for forgiveness, while others claim he was visited by her ghost, her screams echoing through the halls. A year later, on the anniversary of her death, Charles was found hanging from the rafters of the ballroom, a note pinned to his chest that simply read, "She is here." To this day, the locals say that on Halloween night, if you stand outside Blackmore Manor, you can hear Elizabeth's screams as she searches for her husband, her gown still stained with blood. The haunting of Briarcliff Asylum. Perched on a lonely hilltop, the ruins of Briarcliff Asylum have been abandoned for decades, but no one in the surrounding towns dares to go near it, especially on Halloween night. Briarcliff was built in the early 1900s as a sanctuary for the mentally ill, but it quickly gained a dark reputation. In its prime, the asylum was known for its cruel treatments, electroshock therapy, ice baths, and even lobotomies. The staff, under the direction of the twisted Dr. Benjamin Gray, believed in curing madness at any cost. By 1935, patients began to disappear, their records erased, as if they had never existed. Families who came to visit their loved ones were told they had been transferred, but no one knew where. Whispers began to circulate that the asylum was experimenting on its patients, using them as unwilling test subjects in horrific experiments. The darkest tale comes from October 31, 1947. That Halloween, a massive storm rolled through the region, knocking out power to Briarcliff. The asylum descended into chaos. Patients, already on the brink of madness, screamed through the holes as lightning illuminated their faces through bad windows. But it was the night nurse, Alice Reeves, who reported the most chilling incident. She claimed that the storm had somehow opened the gates to something else. Shadows began to move on their own, whispering her name. She saw figures standing at the end of long, dim corridors, figures that shouldn't have been there. By morning, 23 patients and 4 staff members were dead. Some were found huddled in corners, their faces frozen in terror. Others had clawed at their own eyes, driven to madness by whatever they saw. Dr. Gray was found in the basement, his body twisted and broken, his fingernails stained with his own blood, as if he had tried to scratch his way through solid walls. The asylum was shut down immediately after, and those who survived refused to speak of what happened that night. Now, decades later, locals say that on Halloween, if you stand at the bottom of Briarcliff's Hill, you can hear the distant echo of tortured screams carried on the wind. Some brave or foolish explorers have gone into the asylum on Halloween night, hoping to capture a glimpse of the supernatural. None have returned. All that remains are the scratched and weathered walls and the faint sound of doors creaking open in the dead of night. The Hanging Tree of Ravensmoor. In the town of Ravensmoor, at the heart of an ancient forest, there stands a twisted, blackened tree known to locals as the Hanging Tree. The gnarled branches, crooked and bent, loom like skeletal arms, reaching out to claim anyone foolish enough to get too close. Legend has it that in the late 1600s, during the height of witch trials, the tree served as the execution site for those accused of witchcraft. The first to be hanged was Eliza Blackthorne, a woman accused of dark magic after a series of misfortunes befell the town. Crops withered, cattle died, and children grew sick. Though she proclaimed her innocence, Eliza was condemned and dragged to the forest on Halloween night, where the noose was placed around her neck. Before she was hanged, she cursed the town with her final breath, vowing that her spirit would never rest and that anyone who harmed her would pay with their lives. After Eliza's death, strange things began happening in Ravensmoor. The tree itself began to change, its bark blackening as if scorched by an invisible fire. Over the next few years, those involved in Eliza's trial, witnesses, judges, even the hangman, died under mysterious circumstances. Their bodies were found hanging from the tree, despite there being no evidence of anyone having touched them. Some were found swinging in the wind with ropes around their necks. Others simply floated, suspended in midair. For generations, the hanging tree has been avoided, and the curse has been whispered about in dark corners. But in 1978, a group of teenagers, curious and emboldened by the skepticism of modern times, decided to test the legend. On Halloween night, they made their way to the tree with a camera, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural. The next morning, the camera was found lying at the tree's base, the film inside exposed to reveal nothing but swirling shadows and strange, distorted faces. Of the 5 teenagers who went to the tree, only one returned. His mind shattered, he couldn't speak of what he had seen. The only words he could manage were a choked, whispered phrase, "She's still there." Locals say the curse of the hanging tree remains to this day. Each Halloween, if you stand under its twisted branches, you can hear the rustle of ropes swaying in the wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, you might catch the faint outline of a figure, swinging endlessly in the night. The phantom trick or treater of Hollow Creek. In the sleepy town of Hollow Creek, the tradition of trick or treating goes back generations. Each Halloween, children dressed as ghosts, witches, and skeletons roam the streets, collecting candy from every house. But there is one house on Elm Street that no child ever visits, the old Henderson place. It's been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown. No one dares to approach it. The story goes that in the 1950s, a boy named Tommy Henderson lived there with his family. He was a strange child, shy and quiet, often bullied by the other kids. On Halloween night in 1957, Tommy went trick-or-treating by himself. His parents, preoccupied with the party, had let him wander the streets alone. He knocked on door after door, but for some reason no one answered. The other children whispered that Tommy wasn't just being ignored, he was being avoided. They said something was wrong with him, that he wasn't like the other kids. As midnight approached, Tommy still hadn't returned home. His parents grew worried and searched the streets, but he was nowhere to be found. The last anyone saw of him was a glimpse of his small figure standing on the doorstep of the old Willow Creek church, his pale mask glowing faintly under the streetlight. Tommy never came home. The next morning, his parents found his costume neatly folded on the front porch, but no sign of their son. The town searched for weeks, but Tommy had vanished without a trace. In the years that followed, residents of Willow Creek began to report strange sightings. Every Halloween night, just before midnight, a lone trick-or-treater would appear on Elm Street, dressed in an old-fashioned costume, his face hidden behind a pale, cracked mask. He would silently walk from house to house, knocking on doors, but when the door was opened, no one would be there. The knocks were soft, but persistent, and those who heard them reported a sudden, overwhelming sense of sadness and dread. Some say Tommy's spirit still roams the streets of Willow Creek, forever trapped in that final Halloween night. Locals warn each other to never open the door if they hear knocking after midnight on Halloween. If you do, you might just find a small, ghostly figure standing on your doorstep, his empty eyes staring up at you from behind a cracked mask. And if you close the door too late, you'll never see Halloween the same way again. The witching hour of Gallows Hill. In a remote New England town sits Gallows Hill, a place steeped in infamy and dread. Once the site of the town's executions during the Salem witch trials, the hill remains barren and lifeless, its gnarled trees twisted as though they writhe in eternal agony. It's said that during the trials, 13 women were hanged there, all accused of witchcraft. Their spirits never found peace. On Halloween night, the hour between midnight and 1 o'clock is known as the witching hour. Local legend claims that during this time, the witches rise again, replaying their final moments in the veil between life and death. The townsfolk, gripped by superstition, avoid the hill after dark, but in 1963, 3 college students decided to test the legend. They were outsiders, having moved to the town for school. For them, the stories were nothing but exaggerated folklore meant to scare children. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they'd hiked up Gallows Hill just before midnight, determined to capture proof that ghosts didn't exist. The town had warned them, told them about the sounds people heard on Halloween night, the eerie creaking of invisible ropes swinging in the breeze, the soft cries that echo through the valley. But the students scoffed. At first, the hill was quiet. They stood beneath the skeletal trees, joking and taking photos, waiting for something to happen. Midnight struck, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Their breath misted in the air, and the wind began to pick up, whistling through the branches like a distant wail. One of them thought they saw something, movement, just out of the corner of their eye. A shadow flickering through the trees. They laughed it off, attributing it to the wind and the strange atmosphere. But then they heard it, the faint sound of a woman sobbing, followed by the unmistakable creak of a rope under tension. The laughter stopped. Their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The sobbing grew louder, as if coming from all directions at once. Panic set in. They turned to run, but found their path blocked by figures, tall, dark silhouettes hanging from the trees, swaying in the wind. One of the students screamed, swearing he felt cold, skeletal fingers brush against his neck. They ran blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks, the sobs and creaking ropes echoing all around them. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on them. By the time they made it back to town, only 2 of them remained. The 3rd student was never found. His friends insisted that something had taken him, something unseen had dragged him into the shadows. His camera was discovered at the base of the hill the next morning. The last photo it had taken was blurred, but unmistakable. A figure, hanging from the gallows tree, its face twisted in agony, and behind it, a dark shape with glowing eyes, watching. The townspeople weren't surprised. No one escapes Gallows Hill after midnight, they said. Every Halloween, the same warning is passed down. Don't go to Gallows Hill during the witching hour. The witches are still there, waiting for their revenge. The Lantern Man of Deepwater Marsh. On the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, lies the sprawling fog-shrouded expanse of Deepwater Marsh. The marshlands are a tangled web of murky water, gnarled cypress trees, and thick, clinging mist. But the marsh is known for something far more sinister. On Halloween night, a glowing lantern can be seen moving slowly through the fog, carried by the Lantern Man. The legend of the Lantern Man dates back to the 1800s, when the marshlands were home to a small settlement of outcasts, criminals, fugitives, and those who had been shunned by society. One such man was Ezekiel Rolls, a notorious hermit who lived alone deep within the swamp. Ezekiel was a giant of a man, feared by all who knew him, and rumors swirled that he practiced black magic. Children whispered that he had made a pact with the devil himself, trading his soul for eternal life. One Halloween night, after several children went missing near the marsh, a mob from the nearby town took justice into their own hands. They marched into the swamp with torches and pitchforks, hunting Ezekiel. They found him at the heart of the marsh, where they hanged him from an old oak tree. But Ezekiel's dying curse still haunts the town to this day. "I'll walk these waters forever," he had spat as the rope tightened around his neck, "and every soul who dares enter my marsh will be mine." Since that night, the Lantern Man has appeared. Every Halloween, a pale light floats through the fog, flickering like a ghostly lantern. Some say it's Ezekiel himself, wandering the marsh in search of revenge. Others believe it's the spirits of the children who vanished, guiding the unwary to their doom. In the late 1980s, two fishermen ignored the warnings and ventured into Deepwater Marsh on Halloween. They planned to catch the biggest fish of the season, thinking the story was just another ghost tale to scare people away. As the sun set, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the marsh in an impenetrable mist. The men lost their way, and soon they saw the light, a faint, flickering lantern, bobbing in the distance. Thinking it was another boat, they rowed toward it, desperate to find their way out. But as they drew closer, the light moved away, always staying just out of reach. It led them deeper into the marsh, where the water grew still and black as ink. One of the men noticed something wrong. The lantern wasn't attached to a boat. It wasn't being carried by anyone at all. It simply floated in the air, moving silently over the water. Before they could turn back, the lantern vanished. Moments later, something rose from the depths of the swamp, a figure, drenched in water, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light. They tried to row away, but their boat wouldn't move. The last thing they heard was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps splashing through the water toward them. Only one man returned, soaked to the bone, his face twisted in terror. He was found wandering near the edge of the marsh at dawn, mumbling incoherently about the Lantern Man and the water that dragged his friend beneath. Locals say that every Halloween, the Lantern Man still roams the marsh, his glowing light leading the unwary into the swamp's darkest depths, and those who follow it are never seen again. The headless rider of Raven's Peak, a jagged mountain on the edge of an old mining town, is known for its treacherous cliffs and ghostly fogs that sweep across the land each autumn. But it's also known for the tale of the Headless Rider, a specter who haunts the winding trails that snake through the forest below. The legend began during the gold rush of 1868, when the town of Silver Hollow thrived at the foot of Raven's Peak. A gang of ruthless highwaymen terrorized the region, ambushing travelers and stealing their gold. Their leader, a man known only as Cain, was feared for his brutality. It was said he had killed over a dozen men without ever being caught. His signature weapon was a long, gleaming axe, which he used to behead those who crossed him. One fateful Halloween night, Cain and his men planned the ultimate heist, a stagecoach full of gold, set to pass through the valley at dusk. But the townsfolk had grown tired of the gang's reign of terror. That night, they set a trap. Armed with rifles and torches, they ambushed Cain's gang as they waited for the stagecoach. One by one, the outlaws were gunned down, but Cain escaped, fleeing into the dark woods on horseback, his axe swinging as he rode. The posse chased him to the cliffs of Raven's Peak, where Cain, cornered and wounded, made his final stand. In a brutal struggle, he was decapitated by his own axe, his head tumbling down the cliffs and disappearing into the forest below. His body was never found. But the story didn't end there. The very next Halloween, travelers reported seeing a ghostly rider on horseback, charging down the trails of Raven's Peak with a gleaming axe in hand. The rider wore no head, yet galloped through the forest as though searching for something or someone. In the years that followed, the Headless Rider became a fixture of the region's Halloween lore. People claimed to hear the thunderous hoofbeats of his horse echoing through the trees, and some even saw the rider himself, his headless form silhouetted against the moonlit sky, always in search of his lost head. In 1971, a group of hikers, eager to test the legend, ventured into the forest on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights and camping gear, they set up camp near the cliffs of Raven's Peak. As midnight approached, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a banshee's wail. They laughed nervously, dismissing the sounds as nothing more than the mountain's eerie atmosphere. But then they heard it, a steady, rhythmic pounding, like hooves galloping in the distance. The ground began to tremble, and the sound grew louder, closer. Before they could react, a shadowy figure on horseback appeared on the trail above them, charging toward them with terrifying speed. The hikers screamed and fled in all directions, but no matter how fast they ran, the pounding of hooves followed them, relentless. One of them swore she saw the glint of an axe in the rider's hand, raised high as if ready to strike. By dawn, they stumbled back into town, pale and trembling, unable to explain what had chased them. To this day, the headless rider is said to haunt Raven's Peak on Halloween night, forever bound to the mountain, hunting for his lost head, and any soul unfortunate enough to cross his path. The Mirror of Ashmore House. In the quiet town of Ashmore, there's an old mansion that has been abandoned for over a century. The house is known as Ashmore House, and while it stands in perfect condition, no one dares to live there. Its windows are dark, and its doors forever sealed. The townsfolk tell stories of strange occurrences within its walls, but the darkest tale is about the mirror that hangs in the parlor, a cursed mirror that is said to trap the souls of the damned. The legend begins in the late 1800s, when the Ashmore family still lived in the grand estate. Lord Ashmore was a collector of rare and strange artifacts, fascinated by the occult. His most prized possession was an ornate full-length mirror from Venice, rumored to be cursed. According to the legend, the mirror was forged by a sorcerer who imbued it with dark magic, allowing it to trap the reflection of anyone who gazed into it for too long. One Halloween night, Lady Eleanor Ashmore disappeared. Her husband searched the mansion, but she was nowhere to be found. Desperate, Lord Ashmore scoured every room, calling her name. When he entered the parlor, his blood ran cold. There, standing in front of the mirror, was Eleanor, but she was inside it. Her image stood motionless, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes wide in terror. Lord Ashmore tried to break the mirror, but it wouldn't crack. He tried to pull her out, but his hands passed through the glass like water. The next day, he was found dead in front of the mirror, his face twisted in horror. The servants swore they could see Lady Eleanor's face in the mirror, trapped forever in its dark, reflective depths. The house was abandoned shortly after, but the mirror remained. Over the years, curious souls would enter the house on days, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cursed reflection. Few ever returned, and those who did were never the same. They spoke of seeing faces in the mirror, faces that weren't their own, and hands reaching out from the glass, as though something within was trying to pull them in. In 1987, two paranormal investigators, convinced that the stories were nothing more than superstition, snuck into Ashmore House on Halloween night. They brought equipment to record the event, eager to disprove the legend. For hours, nothing happened. The house was cold and empty, and the mirror sat quietly in its frame. But just after midnight, the mirror began to change. A faint mist swirled inside the glass, and the reflection of the room began to distort. One of the investigators claimed he saw movement, someone standing behind him, even though the room was empty. The other man stared into the mirror, mesmerized by the swirling fog within. His reflection slowly faded away, replaced by something else. Another face, pale and lifeless, staring back at him with hollow eyes. Before they could react, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the room plunged into darkness. When help arrived the next morning, they found only one of the investigators sitting motionless in front of the shattered mirror. His eyes were wide and glassy, as though he had seen something too terrible to comprehend. The other man was gone, with no trace of his body. But those who visited the house afterward claimed they could still see his reflection in the shards of the broken mirror, his face twisted in a silent scream, forever trapped in the glass. The ghost train of Blackwood Crossing. The story of Blackwood Crossing is one of tragedy and terror, told by the people of a small mountain town nestled near the old railway tracks. The tracks themselves were abandoned decades ago, after a horrific accident in the early 1900s when the Blackwood Express train derailed on Halloween night, plunging into a ravine and killing everyone on board. But the people of Blackwood Crossing say that the train never truly stopped running. Each year, on the anniversary of the crash, the sound of a train whistle can be heard echoing through the mountains, even though the tracks have long since rusted away. Those who have dared to venture near the old railway on Halloween night report seeing the faint glow of a train's headlights cutting through the fog, and some have claimed to hear the screech of wheels grinding on iron as the phantom train barrels through the night. The story begins with the ill-fated journey of the Blackwood Express, a luxury train that carried passengers through the mountains on its way to a Halloween gala in the neighboring town. The train was filled with wealthy socialites, dressed in their finest attire, eager for a night of celebration. But as the train wound its way through the dark, misty forests of Blackwood, something went wrong. Witnesses in the nearby town claimed to hear the sound of the train's whistle, followed by a deafening crash. When rescuers reached the scene, they found the twisted wreckage of the train scattered across the ravine, its carriages mangled beyond recognition. The bodies of the passengers lay broken among the ruins, their once elegant costumes now drenched in blood. But the horror didn't end there. As the rescuers worked through the night, they began to hear strange sounds, voices, faint but unmistakable, calling for help from the wreckage. Yet when they searched the twisted metal, there were no survivors. One by one, the rescuers fled, haunted by the ghostly voices that echoed through the ravine. In the years that followed, strange sightings were reported near the tracks. People claimed to see shadowy figures standing by the side of the railway, dressed in the formal clothing of the early 1900s. Others reported hearing the faint sound of laughter and music, as though the Halloween gala was still happening somewhere in the distance. One Halloween night in 1974, a group of teenagers from Blackwood Crossing decided to test the legend. They hiked to the site of the crash, hoping to see the infamous ghost train. As midnight approached, they heard it, the long, mournful wail of a train whistle, followed by the distant rumble of wheels on iron tracks. The sound grew louder, and the teenagers saw a pair of glowing headlights cutting through the fog. The train came into view, its carriages shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The passengers inside were dressed in elegant gowns and tuxedos, their faces pale and expressionless as they stared out at the night. The train slowed as it passed the group, and for a moment they could see the conductor standing at the front, his hollow eyes staring straight ahead. Then, without a sound, the train vanished into the mist. When the teenagers returned to town, they swore they had seen the Blackwood Express. One of them, a boy named Alex, was never quite the same after that night. He claimed he could still hear the train whistle in his dreams, and every Halloween he would wake in a cold sweat, convinced the train was coming for him. A year later, on Halloween night, Alex disappeared. His friends searched the tracks near Blackwood Crossing, but there was no sign of him. Only the faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the mountains, fading into the mist. The Bleeding Portraits of Hartwell Manor. Hartwell Manor is a crumbling old estate, hidden deep in the foggy hills of Scotland. Once the grand home of the Hartwell family, it now stands abandoned, its windows broken and its walls covered in ivy. But despite its ruined state, one part of the manor remains untouched, the gallery of family portraits that hang in the east wing, their painted eyes watching every visitor who dares to enter. The portraits are said to be cursed, and the story of their curse is as old as the manor itself. The Hartwell family was known for their wealth and power, but they were also known for their cruelty. In the late 1700s, Lord Alistair Hartwell ruled the estate with an iron fist, and it was said that he took great pleasure in tormenting those beneath him. His wife, Lady Isabel, was no better, known for her cold, unfeeling nature and her disdain for anyone not of noble blood. But the darkest secret of the Hartwell family was their son, Edward. Edward was a disturbed child, prone to violent outbursts and strange, morbid fascinations. As he grew older, he became obsessed with the idea of immortality, convinced that he could trap a person's soul in a painting, binding them to the canvas forever. One Halloween night, Edward set his plan into motion. He invited the local townspeople to the manor for a grand masquerade ball, offering a reward to anyone who could best him in a game of wits. Unbeknownst to them, Edward had other plans. As the guests drank and danced, he led them one by one to the east wing, where his family's portraits hung in the dimly lit gallery. There, Edward performed a dark ritual, trapping the souls of his guests in the paintings. One by one, their eyes flickered with life, and their faces twisted in silent screams as they realized what had been done to them. Edward laughed as he watched the portraits bleed, the thick red droplets staining the canvas. But Edward's victory was short-lived. The souls he had trapped in the portraits rebelled, their painted hands reaching out from the frames to drag him into the gallery. When the servants found him the next morning, Edward's body was slumped on the floor, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. His portrait, once blank, now hung on the wall, his face twisted in eternal agony. Since that night, the portraits of Hartwell Manor have been known to bleed on Halloween. Those who have dared to spend the night in the gallery report hearing whispers in the dark, and some claim to have seen the figures in the paintings move when they weren't looking. The most chilling tale comes from a historian who visited the manor in 1956. He stayed in the East Wing, determined to document the curse. At midnight, he awoke to the sound of dripping. When he turned on his flashlight, he saw it. The portraits were bleeding, thick red tears running down their faces. But the worst part was the eyes. Each pair of painted eyes was fixed on him, watching, pleading. The historian fled the manor, never to return, but his notes remained. In them, he wrote of the last thing he saw before he ran, a figure stepping out of one of the portraits, its hands covered in blood. To this day, no one stays in Hartwell Manor on Halloween night. The portraits still hang in the gallery, their eyes following anyone who dares to walk past, waiting for the next soul to join them. The Bone Collector of Widow's Hollow. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there lies a valley known as Widow's Hollow, a place shrouded in mist and whispers. The locals speak of a creature that roams the woods on Halloween night, a twisted figure known as the Bone Collector. His legend has persisted for generations, warning travelers and townsfolk alike to stay away from the hollow when the autumn moon rises. The story begins in the 1800s with a man named Elias Pike. Elias was a hunter, skilled in tracking and trapping, but he was also a recluse. Living in a cabin on the edge of the hollow, Elias became obsessed with the bones of the animals he hunted. Over time, his collection grew: skulls, rib cages, femurs, all meticulously arranged in grotesque displays inside his cabin. But soon, animal bones were not enough for Elias. The townspeople began to notice that people had gone missing: hunters, travelers, even a few children. Some who ventured too close to Widow's Hollow never returned. The town grew suspicious of Elias, but he vanished before they could confront him. His cabin was found abandoned, the walls covered in strange symbols and markings, and piles of bones, human and animal, littered the floor. Years passed, and the tale of the Bone Collector became little more than a ghost story. But strange things still happen in Widow's Hollow, especially on Halloween. Those who walk too close to the tree line report hearing eerie sounds, the snap of twigs, footsteps that follow but never reveal themselves, and the rattle of bones carried on the wind. In 1932, a group of 4 men, intrigued by the stories, decided to test the legend. They armed themselves with rifles and flashlights, swearing to prove that there was nothing to fear in the hollow. They ventured into the woods at dusk, confident and joking, but as night fell, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing their laughter. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. Soon, they could hear nothing but their own breathing. Then came the sound, a soft, scraping noise, like bones being dragged along the forest floor. It circled them, moving in the darkness. The men called out, demanding to know who was there, but no one answered. Suddenly, one of the men screamed and fell to the ground. His friends rushed to help him, but stopped short when they saw what had happened. His leg was twisted unnaturally, and there, on the ground beside him, was a skeletal hand, still clutching at his ankle. Panic set in. The men ran through the woods, desperate to escape, but the sound of bones followed them, growing louder and louder. One by one, they disappeared into the fog. By morning, only one man returned, his hair turned white from fear. He was found wandering the road near town, mumbling about a creature made of bones that stalked them through the night. He claimed that as they ran, the fog thickened and he saw it, the Bone Collector, his body a horrifying patchwork of skeletal remains, his hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The creature moved silently, except for the clatter of bones that trailed behind him. The last thing the man saw before he blacked out was the collector dragging his friends' bodies into the woods, leaving a trail of blood and bones behind. Since then, no one has dared to enter Widow's Hollow on Halloween. But every year, without fail, the townspeople find something left at the edge of the woods, bones arranged in perfect, unnatural patterns, as though someone or something still lurks in the hollow, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to add to its collection. The Banshee of Crescent Lake, a serene and peaceful body of water nestled in the heart of Maine's dense forests, has long been a favorite spot for hikers, campers, and tourists. But as the crisp air of October settles in and Halloween approaches, few dare to visit. For on this one night, the tranquil lake becomes the haunting ground of the Banshee of Crescent Lake, whose wails pierce the silence, foretelling death to anyone who hears them. The legend dates back to the 1700s, when a young woman named Maura Callahan lived on the shores of the lake with her family. Maura was betrothed to a local fisherman, but tragedy struck just days before their wedding. A terrible storm swept across the lake, capsizing the boat and drowning her fiancé. His body was never recovered. Maura, grief-stricken and unable to accept his death, wandered the shores for days, calling out his name in vain. On Halloween night, consumed by sorrow, she threw herself into the icy waters, where she too drowned. But Maura's spirit did not find peace. Her anguished cries were heard echoing across the lake the next morning, and those who ventured too close reported seeing her figure, pale and dripping with water, standing on the shore, her eyes filled with despair. Over the years, the legend grew, and people began to avoid Crescent Lake, especially on Halloween. It became known that anyone who heard Maura's wails would be marked for death, their own tragic fate sealed by the Banshee's curse. In the 1950s, a group of teenagers, unaware or dismissive of the legend, decided to spend Halloween night camping by the lake. They laughed at the old stories, confident that they were just tales meant to scare children. They set up their tents and built a fire, the flames casting long shadows across the still waters. As midnight approached, the air grew unnaturally cold. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending shivers down their spines. Then, from across the lake, they heard it, a long mournful wail that sent a chill straight to their bones. The sound echoed through the trees, growing louder and more sorrowful with each passing moment. At first, they joked that it was the wind, but the sound grew too clear, too human. One of the teens swore he saw a figure standing in the distance, just at the water's edge, a woman, her long hair hanging wet and limp over her shoulders, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. She raised her arms, and another wail cut through the air, louder this time, filled with a grief that seemed to seep into their very souls. Panicking, the group scrambled to pack up and leave, but it was too late. One of the boys tripped and fell into the water. His friends rushed to pull him out, but as they did, they saw something else beneath the surface. A pale hand, cold and lifeless, reaching up from the depths, trying to drag him down. They ran, leaving their tents and supplies behind, desperate to escape the lake and the wailing that still echoed in their ears. By morning, they were found huddled on the side of the road, shaking and terrified. The boy who had fallen into the water was missing, his body never recovered. In the years that followed, those who had heard the Banshee's wail on that Halloween night met with untimely deaths, one by drowning, another in a car crash, and the last by illness that struck suddenly and without warning. To this day, the Banshee of Crescent Lake still wails on Halloween night, her cries echoing across the water, searching for her lost love and marking those who hear her with death. Those who dare to visit the lake leave as soon as the sun sets, for they know the curse still lingers, and the Banshee is always watching. The drowned children of Willow Creek. In the remote countryside of Louisiana, there is a small, forgotten waterway known as Willow Creek. For most of the year, the creek is shallow and quiet, its surface still and murky. But on Halloween night, locals say that the creek comes alive with the voices of the drowned children, whose tragic deaths haunt the water to this day. The story dates back to the 1920s, when a small orphanage stood on the banks of Willow Creek. It was run by a cold, severe woman named Miss Lydia who, by all accounts, was more interested in discipline than care. The children, most of them abandoned by families too poor to keep them, were often left unsupervised, with little to do but play near the creek's edge. One Halloween, The children begged Miss Lydia to let them celebrate. They had heard the townsfolk speak of costumes and candy, but they had never experienced the holiday themselves. Begrudgingly, Miss Lydia allowed them to make simple masks out of paper and play by the creek before dusk. What happened next remains a mystery. Some say it was an accident, perhaps one child slipped, and the others tried to help, only to be pulled into the cold water by the strong currents. Others whisper of something darker, claiming that the creek had been cursed long before the orphanage was built. What is certain is that by nightfall, none of the children returned to the orphanage. Miss Lydia searched in vain, her lantern light flickering over the water's edge, but the children were gone. Their small paper masks floated eerily on the surface of the creek, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. For days, the townsfolk combed the water, but no bodies were ever found. The orphanage was shut down soon after, and Miss Lydia, consumed by guilt and fear, disappeared one night, never to be seen again. But the creek did not forget. Each year, on Halloween, the sound of children's laughter is said to echo through the trees. Those brave enough to venture near the water after dark report seeing ghostly figures, small, pale children, their clothes dripping with water, standing at the creek's edge. They beckon to passers-by, asking if they want to play. And sometimes, just sometimes, they step into the water and vanish, leaving behind only ripples and soft, distant cries. In 1974, a group of teenagers, skeptical of the old legends, decided to camp near Willow Creek on Halloween. They'd brought beer and sleeping bags, daring one another to call out to the drowned children. At first, the night was filled with laughter and jokes, the legends seeming silly in the light of their campfire. But as midnight approached, the air grew colder and the creek seemed to come alive. The teenagers heard the unmistakable sound of splashing, gentle at first, then louder, as if someone was walking through the water. They turned their flashlights toward the creek and froze. There, standing in the shallow water, were 3 children, their eyes hollow and lifeless, their hands outstretched. One of the boys screamed and ran, but the others were too mesmerized by what they saw. The children beckoned, their voices soft but insistent. "Come play with us." One of the girls, unable to resist, stepped toward the water, her feet sinking into the mud. The others grabbed her, pulling her back just as one of the ghostly children lunged forward, its small, wet hand grasping at her ankle. They fled, leaving behind their gear and their campfire, but when they reached the road, they realized the girl who had been pulled toward the water was gone. The next morning, the police found nothing but the remnants of their camp and a single sodden paper mask floating in the creek. Since that night, no one dares go near Willow Creek on Halloween. The drowned children still haunt the water, their laughter echoing through the trees, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to join them in their eternal playtime beneath the surface. The silent lodge of Whispering Pines. High in the Adirondack Mountains, hidden deep within the forest, lies Whispering Pines Lodge, an old crumbling inn that has been abandoned for nearly a century. Once a popular retreat for wealthy vacationers seeking peace and quiet in nature, the lodge is now a place that few dare to visit. On Halloween night, however, its eerie silence is broken, for it is said that the lodge comes alive with the ghosts of the guests who vanished there long ago. In the early 1920s, Whispering Pines was owned by a man named Horace Wilkes, a wealthy entrepreneur who prided himself on offering an exclusive, luxurious experience. His guests came from all over the country to enjoy the serenity of the mountains, the crisp air, and the beautiful views. But in 1926, something terrible happened that would forever stain the lodge's reputation. On Halloween weekend of that year, the lodge hosted a large gathering of prominent figures, businessmen, socialites, and their families. It was meant to be a grand celebration, with music, dancing, and extravagant feasts. But as the night wore on, a terrible storm rolled in, cutting the lodge off from the outside world. The winds howled through the trees, and the power went out, plunging the lodge into darkness. The next morning, the staff arrived to find the lodge eerily quiet. The ballroom, which had been filled with music and laughter the night before, was empty. The guests were gone. Every room had been left in perfect order, beds neatly made, luggage untouched. But there was no sign of life, no footprints in the snow, no messages left behind. It was as if they had all simply vanished into thin air. The only clue was a strange, oppressive silence that hung over the lodge, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The lodge was abandoned shortly after, and rumors spread that the spirits of the missing guests still lingered within its walls, trapped in whatever mysterious event had claimed their lives. In the decades since, a few brave souls have ventured into Whispering Pines Lodge on Halloween night, hoping to uncover the truth. Most return with stories of strange phenomena, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the faint strains of old-time music drifting through the air, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. But some never return at all. In 1985, a team of paranormal investigators decided to spend Halloween night at the lodge, determined to document its hauntings. Armed with cameras, recording devices, and infrared scanners, they set up camp in the grand ballroom, where the guests had last been seen. The night began quietly enough, but as the storm outside intensified, so did the activity inside the lodge. The investigators reported hearing faint whispers, too low to make out, as if dozens of voices were speaking just out of earshot. Their equipment began to malfunction, with cameras flickering on and off and temperature readings plummeting to freezing. Then, just before midnight, the ballroom doors, rusted and unused for years, swung open on their own, and the sound of laughter filled the room. It wasn't the joyous, light-hearted laughter of partygoers, though. It was distant, echoing, and strangely distorted, like a record playing too slow. One of the investigators saw shadows moving across the floor, dancing in time with the music that no one else could hear. Another felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, though no one was standing near her. At midnight, the wind howled through the lodge, and all at once, the room fell deathly silent. In the corner of the ballroom, one of the investigators saw a figure, a man in a tuxedo, his face pale and expressionless, staring blankly ahead. Behind him, more figures began to appear, all dressed in 1920s finery, their faces frozen in the same eerie stillness. The investigators fled, leaving behind their equipment and the footage they had captured. When they returned the next day, the lodge was silent once more. But the tapes they recovered revealed something chilling. The final moments before they left showed the ballroom filled with people, figures that none of them had seen in real time. The ghosts of Whispering Pines Lodge had come back for their final dance. No one knows what happened to the guests of Whispering Pines Lodge on that fateful Halloween night in 1926, but their spirits remain trapped in the silence of the lodge, waiting for anyone brave, or foolish, enough to join them in their eternal spectral party. The black-eyed children of Crooked Hollow. The children's eyes, black, lifeless, and cold, seemed to follow every movement. Whenever Jacob or his wife tried to ask them questions, the children gave short, whispered answers that never quite made sense. They never blinked, and their pale faces remained eerily still, devoid of any emotion. As the night deepened, strange things began to happen in the farmhouse. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, unnatural fog began to roll in from the fields, wrapping itself around the house like a suffocating blanket. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, and the wind outside howled like a pack of wolves. Jacob's youngest daughter, Lily, began to cry, saying she was scared of the children, that their eyes weren't right. When Jacob confronted the children, demanding to know where they had come from, they simply stood in the doorway, their black eyes glimmering in the dim light. "Let us in," they said in unison, their voices low and menacing. "We need to come inside." But they were already inside. Horrified, Jacob slammed the door to the sitting room where the children had been standing. He tried to lock it, but the doorknob wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it from the other side. The air in the house grew thick, heavy with dread, and the walls seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. Suddenly, the lights flickered out, plunging the farmhouse into complete darkness. Jacob and his wife scrambled to find their children, but in the pitch black, they could hear only the faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and too close. The children with the black eyes were still there, waiting, watching. "Let us in," the voices whispered again, but this time it seemed to come from everywhere. The walls, the floor, even the air itself. The family huddled together, terrified, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The wind died, the fog receded, and the house fell into an unnatural silence. When Jacob dared to open the door, the black-eyed children were gone. The next morning, Jacob packed up his family and left Crooked Hollow, abandoning the farmhouse for good. But the legend of the black-eyed children was just beginning. Over the years, townsfolk began to speak of strange encounters on Halloween night. People would hear soft knocks at their doors, and when they answered, they would find children standing on their porch, pale, gaunt, and dressed in outdated clothes. The children would ask to come inside, claiming they were lost or that they needed help. But there was always something wrong with them, something unnatural. Their eyes, jet black and soulless, seemed to bore into whoever they were speaking to, filling them with a deep, inexplicable dread. No one who let them in was ever seen again. In the early 1990s, a local sheriff was called to investigate the disappearance of an elderly couple who had lived on the outskirts of town near Crooked Hollow. Their front door had been found wide open, and inside, the house was in perfect order, except for one thing. The words "Let USN" were scrawled across the walls in black tripping letters. There was no sign of the couple. The sheriff, skeptical of the old legends, dismissed the incident as a prank. But when he reviewed the couple's phone records, he found a single brief call made to 911 on the night they vanished. The recording was garbled, but one thing stood out: the sound of a child's voice whispering, "Let us in." A few years later, a young couple reported a similar encounter. On Halloween night, just after dusk, they heard a soft knock on their door. When they opened it, they found two children, a boy and a girl, standing on the porch. The children were pale, their clothes tattered, and their heads bowed. The couple asked if they were lost, but the children didn't answer. Instead, they slowly lifted their heads, revealing their black, soulless eyes. The couple slammed the door and locked it, but for the rest of the night, they could hear soft knocking at their windows, the sound of footsteps circling the house. The next morning, the couple found tiny handprints smeared on every window, as if the children had been trying to get in all night. To this day, no one knows where the black-eyed children come from or what they want. Some believe they are spirits, cursed to wander the earth, searching for someone to invite them inside. Others think they are something darker, entities from another realm, preying on the weak and the unsuspecting. But one thing is certain: when the black-eyed children come knocking, you must never, ever let them in. The man in the attic of Barrow House. The old Barrow House, sitting on the outskirts of town, was once a grand estate. Built in the early 1800s, it had passed through many hands over the years, each new owner trying, and failing, to rid the house of its dark past. The house had gained a reputation for being cursed, its history marred by tragedy and death. But the most disturbing tale that haunted the Barrow House was the story of the man in the attic. The legend began in the 1890s, when the wealthy Barrow family lived in the mansion. For years, they had servants come and go, but one by one, they all left in a hurry, refusing to speak of what they had seen. They said something wasn't right in the house, especially after dark. But it wasn't until the family's eldest daughter, Abigail, vanished that the rumors of the attic began. Abigail was 16 when she disappeared. One stormy night, she went to bed as usual, but the next morning, her room was empty. Her parents searched the house, combing every corner, but she was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and eventually they called in the police. The only clue was a single muddy footprint found on the floor of the attic. After Abigail's disappearance, strange noises began to come from the attic. The servants reported hearing heavy footsteps pacing back and forth, even though the attic had been locked since the search for Abigail. At night, the creaking of floorboards echoed through the house, and soft, muffled whispers could be heard from above, though no one was there. Then came the sightings. Several maids claimed to have seen a tall, shadowy figure lurking at the top of the attic stairs, watching them with cold, lifeless eyes. One servant, terrified, left in the middle of the night, refusing to even collect her belongings. The Barrows, desperate to rid themselves of the curse, hired an exorcist, but it did no good. The footsteps continued, louder than ever, and the whispers grew more persistent, sometimes calling out Abigail's name. Eventually, the family abandoned the house, leaving it to fall into ruin, but the house never truly emptied. Over the years, squatters, drifters, and even paranormal investigators have entered Barrow House, hoping to uncover the truth behind the attic. Few made it through the night. In 1975, a group of university students, eager to debunk the haunted legend, decided to spend Halloween night in Barrow House. Armed with recording equipment and flashlights, they set up camp in the dusty old parlor, laughing at the idea of ghosts. But as midnight approached, the temperature in the house dropped suddenly, and the faint sound of footsteps began to echo from above. At first, the students dismissed it as the house settling, but the footsteps grew louder, pacing back and forth above them. One of the girls, nervously joking, said she would go check the attic. As she climbed the stairs, the others waited below, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. Moments later, they heard her scream, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. They rushed upstairs, but she was gone. The attic door, which had been locked for decades, now stood wide open. Inside the attic, they found nothing but dust and cobwebs until they saw it. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the dark, the man in the attic was watching them. His face was pale and drawn, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. The students fled the house, but the girl was never seen again. The police found no trace of her, just an old broken doll lying at the foot of the attic stairs. The legend of the man in the attic lives on, and to this day, people swear they can hear his footsteps echoing through the empty halls of Barrow House. Those who dare to enter say that if you listen closely, you can still hear him pacing in the attic, waiting for someone to join him in his eternal watch over the forgotten haunted house. The Banshee of Crescent Lake. Crescent Lake, a serene and peaceful body of water nestled in the heart of Maine's dense forests, has long been a favorite spot for hikers, campers, and tourists. But as the crisp air of October settles in and Halloween approaches, few dare to visit. For on this one night, the tranquil lake becomes the haunting ground of the Banshee of Crescent Lake, whose wails pierce the silence, foretelling death to anyone who hears them. The legend dates back to the 1700s, when a young woman named Maura Callahan lived on the shores of the lake with her family. Maura was betrothed to a local fisherman, but tragedy struck just days before their wedding. A terrible storm swept across the lake, capsizing the boat and drowning her fiancé. His body was never recovered. Maura, grief-stricken and unable to accept his death, wandered the shores for days, calling out his name in vain. On Halloween night, consumed by sorrow, she threw herself into the icy waters, where she too drowned. But Maura's spirit did not find peace. Her anguished cries were heard echoing across the lake the next morning, and those who ventured too close reported seeing her figure, pale and dripping with water, standing on the shore, her eyes filled with despair. Over the years, the legend grew, and people began to avoid Crescent Lake, especially on Halloween. It became known that anyone who heard Maura's wails would be marked for death, their own tragic fate sealed by the Banshee's curse. In the 1950s, a group of teenagers, unaware or dismissive of the legend, decided to spend Halloween night camping by the lake. They laughed at the old stories, confident that they were just tales meant to scare children. They set up their tents and built a fire, the flames casting long shadows across the still waters. As midnight approached, the air grew unnaturally cold. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending shivers down their spines. Then, from across the lake, they heard it, a long, mournful wail that sent a chill straight to their bones. The sound echoed through the trees, growing louder and more sorrowful with each passing moment. At first, they joked that it was the wind, but the sound grew too clear, too human. One of the teens swore he saw a figure standing in the distance, just at the water's edge, a woman, her long hair hanging wet and limp over her shoulders, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. She raised her arms, and another wail cut through the air, louder this time, filled with a grief that seemed to seep into their very souls. Panicking, the group scrambled to pack up and leave, but it was too late. One of the boys tripped and fell into the water. His friends rushed to pull him out, but as they did, they saw something else beneath the surface. A pale hand, cold and lifeless, reaching up from the depths, trying to drag him down. They ran, leaving their tents and supplies behind, desperate to escape the lake and the wailing that still echoed in their ears. By morning, they were found huddled on the side of the road, shaking and terrified. The boy who had fallen into the water was missing, his body never recovered. In the years that followed, those who had heard the Banshee's wail on that Halloween night met with untimely deaths, one by drowning, another in a car crash, and the last by illness that struck suddenly and without warning. To this day, the Banshee of Crescent Lake still wails on Halloween night, Her cries echoing across the water, searching for her lost love and marking those who hear her with death. Those who dare to visit the lake leave as soon as the sun sets, for they know the curse still lingers and the banshee is always watching.